Hi there. Welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Everything is a total mess edition. So, a lot's been happening over the last couple of days, starting with Biden calling Netanyahu, demanding to bring in more aid to open the Erez crossing and to move towards a hostage deal. This was immediately followed by a couple of major developments. The mediators in the negotiations about the hostage deals reported a lot of progress. A new American deal was put on the table. And perhaps most surprisingly, the IDF withdrew most of its forces from Gaza. It already had withdrawn most of its forces from Gaza earlier, once it had finished clearing all of Gaza City and most of Khan Younis. Now it had finished its operations in Khan Younis. So all of the troops were sent back, aside from the Nahal Brigade. The Nahal Brigade is sitting on the line that divides the north of the Gaza Strip from the south of the Gaza Strip, and they're still keeping the population out, but not from Khan Younis. So since the IDF has withdrawn, we've seen a lot of people go from Rafah to Khan Younis, nowhere near enough to make the operation in Rafah possible, but the beginning of that sort of movement. Now, the IDF believes that it can continue to operate in Gaza despite the withdrawal. One of the things that led to this was the death of a few soldiers in recent days, despite the fact that Israel is not taking new territory. And it's hoping that it can continue to do effective raids like the one that happened in Shifa, which killed a lot of terrorists and brought in a lot of good intelligence, without the military sitting there as sitting ducks, allowing for Hamas attacks on them. Because that's usually how Israeli soldiers have been dying. They've been in barracks, buildings have collapsed on them due to various bombings or errors, sometimes errors by Israel, sometimes attacks by Hamas. Israel's really trying to avoid that mess, which at this point really has diminishing returns on the strategic level. And of course, the IDF hasn't been given the order to go into Rafah. And it's very important to note that this isn't an IDF decision not to go into Rafah. It's a decision of the cabinet and the government not to go into Rafah. So the IDF is adapting to the fact that it's pretty much completed most of the missions that it can in Gaza and withdrawing. Now, the decision to do that seems to have predated the whole WCK aid worker debacle by at least a week. So it's not about that, but the timing may have been used in order to encourage Biden and prevent some of the anger that was seen from the Biden administration. All these steps have mollified the administration somewhat, and they've praised Netanyahu for these steps, so it's helped. Having said that, um, the negotiation team, headed by Dedi Barnea and Nitzan Alon and others, were very disappointed at this move, which they see as removing the military leverage over Hamas in the middle of negotiations. And they believe, I believe correctly, that it lowers the odds of achieving a hostage deal. Of course, it doesn't really forward the Israeli goal of defeating Hamas either. So even though it makes sense on a tactical level, it doesn't make sense on a strategic level, which is something that we've seen repeatedly in this operation. So where is the operation standing right now? Well, we have very intense negotiations over a hostage deal right now. And we'll talk about that and about the terms and how likely that is to succeed. So until that ends one way or another, there will be no entry into Rafah. Netanyahu keeps making cabinet decisions for show and announcing that Israel is going to Rafah without doing it. It's already done that 4 times, most recently a few days ago. And today, as all these rumors about a hostage deal approaching were floated, he said that the decision to go into Rafah has already been decided on, and there's already a date, though he did not reveal the date. Now, to say that his declarations of going into Rafah are not inspiring confidence among Israelis and not threatening particularly Hamas, who don't believe him, is, to put it mildly. He's lost a lot of credibility on this. None of that means that he will never do it, but his words at this point mean nothing. Actions have to be taken. Israel's bought a bunch of tents, which is something necessary for the removal of people from Rafah, but that isn't really convincing of the kind of preparations you would need in order to do that. And the fact that Israel hasn't done those preparations yet, even if it's not intending to go, just to frighten Hamas, is really raising some questions among people who are following this, like myself, for example. Um, so, moving all that aside, what's been taking all the headlines in the last few days are the hostage negotiations. Now, the Paris framework, which was refined in Doha and in Cairo, has basically been replaced by a new American framework, a new framework that goes much further towards Hamas, while also taking most of the Israeli interests into account. So what is that framework? It's similar to Paris, but expands on it in various ways or goes towards Hamas in various ways. Um, has two stages. The first stage is along the lines of what we've been talking about recently with the release of 40 hostages in return for a bunch of prisoners and a short ceasefire. The second stage would be the one which would involve the release of all the hostages and the end of the war. The second stage remains vague because so far the first stage has not been worked out. And Israel doesn't want to talk about the end of the war yet, so you can only talk about the first stage at this point. Now, what is the issue there? For a while, what experts have been saying, I've never agreed with them, by the way, is that the main point of contention between Israel and Hamas is over the return of Palestinian refugees to the north, something that Israel has insisted that it's against at first, then started saying it's willing to have women and children, then started saying it's willing to have men too, as long as it can check them, then said it was below numbers, now it's agreeing to higher numbers. The United States has suggested that Israel allowing 6,000 a day, which is a much larger number than agreed to before. Before it was around 2,000. And Israel will be allowed to search them or try to use whatever means it can to stop terrorists from coming in. Hamas is against the Israeli checking element. Most of the Israeli cabinet is for the 6,000 with checking. Netanyahu apparently is against it and would vote against it. The United States is also calling for 500 aid trucks a day. Now, during the war, most of the time, it was between 100 and 200 that came in. Since the call from Biden, Israel has upped that significantly. Yesterday it was over 300, and today it was over 400. So I don't think 500 a day will be a big deal. Israel will agree to it. Israel will agree to more. So that's probably the least of a sticking point. Then we've got the issue of the hostages. This is much more complicated. As you might remember, the Paris framework called for the release of 40 humanitarian hostages with an emphasis on those with very serious concern women, children, the elderly, the sick, that sort of thing. Hamas seems to have indicated to Qatar that it doesn't have 40 humanitarian hostages who are alive. If true, that is devastating news for the families and for Israel in general. Um, Israel said that it is willing to accept soldiers and men instead. So let's say there's 33 humanitarian hostages, accept 7 soldiers and men, and pay higher prices for each one of them while maintaining the lower price for the humanitarian um, hostages. Now, what would be that price? So we don't know exactly what it would be for soldiers, but what the document did say is that Israel would release 150 prisoners for each humanitarian hostage. Before, Israel was willing to give 100 per hostage. So now it's 150. Um, the numbers for the second stage aren't clear. It's not clear if Israel agreed to 150, but they would, in my opinion. I don't think that would be a terminal sticking point. Then the US suggested a partial Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Israel's already done that. So it's kind of lost leverage. Maybe it would require some more withdrawal that Israel hasn't already done. I mean, definitely it would. But since Israel already did that, it's again something Israel would do. Hamas is demanding a full withdrawal. Now, I've always said that this is the main sticking point. The end of the war and the full withdrawal. Hamas has been insisting on that. And because Hamas feels that it's winning the war, there's no reason for them to back off on that, especially when Israel's already withdrawing without making an agreement, which is another reason the withdrawal from Gaza was a strategic mistake. Israel will reopen the two main routes in Gaza according to the American framework, the Al Rashid and the Salah ad-Din roads, and they'll keep 500 meters away from both. That will allow movement from the north to the south much more easily. The advantage for that, from the Israeli perspective, is it'll make an advantage of Rafah easier. Disadvantage, it'll make it easier for terrorists to go back up north. What are the chances of this being accepted? Well, Israel would accept it, I think, almost 100%. Netanyahu would maybe cause some problems, but he's under too much pressure to agree. He'd agree. Hamas, on the other hand, I don't think are going to agree to this for the reasons I already stated. And at least two Hamas officials, Ali Baraka and Mahmoud Mardawi, have already said that they're turning this down. The official line is not that they're turning it down, not yet. They said that they will take 48 hours to evaluate. Sinwar hasn't seen the full proposal yet, or at least hasn't answered the full proposal yet. My guess is he will say no. Why would he say yes? I certainly wouldn't if I was him. So Israel's already removed a lot of its leverage by withdrawing. It's already removed a lot of its leverage by allowing in aid. But most of the leverage that it's lost isn't because of either of those things. It's because it hasn't gone into Rafah, and it doesn't look serious about going into Rafah. So there's a really serious problem going on here. Now, the best thing about this development, I don't think it's a really good development, this proposal and the fact that Hamas is going to turn it down, is that because of Israel's cooperation with the Biden administration, they're calling Hamas's bluff, and they'll be able to remove some of the wrath of the Biden government and perhaps the international community, at least the friendly countries like the UK, Canada, and others, by doing so. That's not a big advantage. It's not going to help Israel for very long. We know how short-lived international goodwill is to Israel. So right now, it looks like Israel doesn't have the will to win the war. Hamas sees that. Israel's under too much pressure to go into Rafah. It feels without paying too much of a cost. Hamas sees that. Israel has never appeared closer to losing the war than it does right now. That doesn't mean it's lost the war. That doesn't mean it's irreversible, but that is where we're standing right now. Hamas believes Israel will eventually withdraw in return for getting the hostages, and Hamas will remain in power. Okay. I have a bunch of questions, a lot of comments, fewer questions, a lot of comments. Keep the comments coming in if you don't have a question. I enjoy reading them all. Let's start with Harry Newhoff, friend of the show. He asked a lot of questions. I'm not answering all of them, but I'll answer most of them. So Harry said, you said you don't think a Hezbollah-Lebanon war will happen. When will the Northerners be able to return? Well, that's another good side of the fact that Israel is caving on a lot of its demands, is that once Israel agrees to a ceasefire, Hezbollah and Lebanon will stop being a front, at least for the time being. The residents will be able to go home once a ceasefire is agreed to. A temporary ceasefire probably wouldn't be enough, but a permanent ceasefire would be. So whenever Israel caves, if it caves, the people in the north will be able to go back home. That's good news for them. It's bad news for them because Israel will have lost a lot of its deterrence, and you could argue that a war in the north with Hezbollah is just a matter of time once they smell Israel's weakness. So even the good news is not that great. If the war continues for the foreseeable future, I don't see them being able to go back because unless Israel invades Lebanon, and that would lead to a whole bunch of other issues, and I don't think Netanyahu is willing to face them. Harry also asks, given that in 48, 67, arguably 73, Israel won without much, from my limited understanding, support, why would now be any different? So that's actually not true. In 1948, Israel had a lot of support from the international community in the sense that they had permission from the UN to exist to in certain borders. The United States recognized it during the war, and the Soviet Union, through Czechoslovakia, armed Israel. It's true that there was a arms embargo on Israel, but the United States allowed a lot of arms to come in unofficially. By the way, through the mob, it's a fascinating story. But the United States was on Israel's side very tacitly. Russia was on Israel's side not tacitly. It wanted Israel to defeat the British proxies, which were Jordan and Egypt and Iraq. So it armed Israel, supported Israel. So Israel had great power support. I won't go into the other ones, but in 1967, 1973, Israel got American permission to do what it was doing. And without that, the wars would have gone very differently. So Israel's doctrine from Ben Gurion and onward was always only to fight wars when it has the support of one of the great powers. And the one time it didn't do that in 1956, it had to withdraw in shame, which is one of the reasons it has that doctrine. Okay, three. Do you think they killed the Iranian general to get the attention off the WCK scandal? Um, well, I can't tell you for sure. The timeline does seem possible for that, but I think the opportunity of having all those big names in one room at one time and having the intelligence on it is so tempting that Israel would have done it at any time. It's not that easy to find all these people in one room at one time and know about it. So of course there's the problem of it being a diplomatic site, but I think Israel would have gone for it anyway earlier in the war. So I don't see that. It certainly didn't hurt, but it doesn't really deflect attention from the WCK scandal in a good way, right? It makes Israel seem kind of trigger happy. So I don't think it really helped with that if that was the goal, and I don't think that's what it was. Another question. What are your thoughts on breaking the silence? I've spoken with friends who served in recent years, and they shared incidents where fellow soldiers face consequences, such as military jail terms, simply for firing warning shots and the like. They find the notion that soldiers are shooting people dead without repercussions absurd. What say you? I say a couple of things. I think the Israeli military has traditionally been pretty good about these things, and it's still keeping some discipline. But I think in this war, it's lost a lot of that discipline. There's a lot of anger towards Hamas. But there's never been in another war such hatred for the other side. There's always been plenty of that, but not on this level. And this war is very complicated. And there's so much support for the war and hatred for Hamas in the Israeli public that disciplining soldiers is a lot more difficult than it was in the past. So, from what I'm hearing, unfortunately, there's a lot less discipline in this war than there were in past wars. And a lot of the anecdotal evidence from videos that are surfacing, those that are verified, not the Hollywood made up ones, but the real ones, is very concerning. And I think shows a pattern of that. And people I'm talking to in the army now are telling me that. I think those of us who served in the army in the past, um, we served in a different army. And things were very different back then. Michelle Wright, close friend of the show, asks, this has been like watching a slow motion disaster. We knew a clock was ticking. I can't help but think Bibi has calculated this in order to stay into power. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I spent the first few months of this war supporting Netanyahu, not supporting him in the sense I wanted him to stay in power. I never did, but supporting him in the sense that let's support him during the war and help him win. But it's become very clear that best case scenario, he can't win. And worst case scenario, he's trying not to win. And the fact that the war is going so incredibly slowly, even though there's a diplomatic clock on it, and no one knows that better than Netanyahu because Netanyahu served in the Israeli diplomatic corps in the 1980s and is very aware of all these rules and how they operate. I think it's a very good indication that he's not doing this for the right reasons. I say that with a lot of sadness. Cool Snow 7 asks, a lot has changed in the hour since you posted this, talking about my video about the WCK disaster. Now that Israel has opened the Erez crossing, authorized aid to go through Ashdod, and started firing people associated with the incident, how much more optimistic are you that Israel, despite Bibi, can salvage this? So when you posted this, it did look a little bit better. And right now, it does still look a little bit better in the terms of Israel has fixed some or ameliorated some of the damage it caused with the United States. But I don't see that Israel is anywhere near being able to use that to its advantage to actually win the war. I hope I'm wrong. Edan asks, don't you think part of the reason the IDF has withdrawn from the south is to allow civilians to return home to make a Rafah operation more acceptable for Biden? Yes, yes. I think that the IDF was stuck in a situation where it was in Gaza and wasn't achieving any new goals, putting soldiers at risk and stopping people from going out of Rafah. So it figured if it withdrew, there were several advantages. One of those advantages was so that refugees would withdraw. And this isn't making it acceptable for Biden. It's also about that, but it's also about not killing civilians so that there's less of an international outcry in general. And it also operations in Rafah will be easier for the soldiers without lots of civilians. There'll be less of a risk to them. So it's very good in that regard. Having said that, the downside is probably strategically speaking even bigger. And that's assuming, of course, that Israel goes into Rafah, which it might, but is not really that clear that it will. Hallie asks, is the recovery of hostages and taking out Hamas leadership still a valid goal, since it would require bombing the remainder of Gaza? So I guess it depends on what you mean by a valid goal. Mm, From the Israeli perspective, taking out the Hamas leadership and freeing the hostages has always been a valid goal and remains a valid goal. It's a question of whether that's achievable. From the perspective of Israel's enemies, that's never been a valid goal. So valid goals are subjective. And to Israel, those are very valid goals, very morally justifiable. I think they're morally justifiable. I still support Israeli efforts to do it. I just haven't seen that the Israeli tactics in this war are truly suitable to achieving those goals. Okay, so if you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks to the new people who've started supporting me recently. I really appreciate it very, very much. And I also have a new episode of the History Podcast out. It's about the 12 tribes of Israel and what's happened to them since the years that they were, quote unquote, lost, and where they exist, do they exist, and what legends have emerged about them since. So check that out, and I will see you here soon with hopefully new news.